Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for jumping in and joining this really important webinar this morning where we're talking about accessibility, both the lived experience, the need to elevate, and also the need to make sure we maintain and continue great accessibility on all the digital things that we create, whether that's websites, apps, or otherwise. My name's Nick Condon. I'm Managing Director for Squiz here in the UK and Europe, and really thrilled this morning to have this webinar about something that's really important here at Squiz, and I know really important to each of our speakers this morning. Throughout the course of this morning, you'll see there's a question and answer section within this webinar. By all means, place your questions there. We'd love to try and answer as many of those as we can, and the ones that we don't get to, we'll absolutely get back to those individuals after the webinar this morning. If I can ask you to please keep your microphones off, just to minimize noise throughout this morning's conversation, and please make sure that your engagement is high. We've got some great speakers here to talk through some really important things. To start with is Llewelyn Bailey. Llewelyn is Web Officer at the University of Highlands and Islands. We've also got Neil Jarvis, who is a consultant at accessibility consultancy Intopia, and also has lived experience of the need for accessibility tools. Hugh Williams, who's the Head of Development for Squiz here and Europe, and we are really thrilled to get into this morning's conversation. So let's kick off, I guess, with the thing that not everybody has a true understanding of. And Neil, this question's for you. You have lived experience of needing accessibility tools. What's life like for you trying to interact with digital things and having those accessibility needs?
Well, it's a whole lot better than it was before there was digital options, but I would say that it is a little bit of a lucky dip experience. So, um, in order to interact as a citizen in 2023, you really do have to have accessible content, online content. And my experience is that often it is. Last week, I was able to conduct completely on my own the 2023 census that we have here in New Zealand, where I'm based. Um, Alternatively, I recently flew back to New Zealand from overseas, and I could not fill out the form that was mandatory for me to fill out in order to be able to re-enter the country because of COVID restrictions. The form was inaccessible. I very nearly was barred from my own country. So the experience can be very mixed and can be very positive and much better than it ever was in the days before digital online content. But it can also be a real slap in the face when it doesn't work properly.
Right. So I guess that as things are improving, that expectation that things are more accessible is there. And I guess then when they're not, like you say, almost being locked out of your country, that's a real blocker to being able to interact as a citizen, both
Yeah,
in New Zealand and across the globe.
that's right. Yeah. And my experience is I know, because I obviously talk with many people around the world, it's echoed everywhere.
Yeah. Neil, that's really interesting insight. What about some of the day-to-day things that you do? Is there examples where, I don't know, when you're shopping or when you're
Yep.
going about the things day to day, what are some of the challenges or some of maybe the interesting things that accessibility and digital accessibility tools help with?
Well, so much of what we do nowadays, of course, is online, and with the pandemic, everything was online for a while. And frankly, that suited me in many ways because I'm an online sort of guy when I can be. But I do recall the first experiences I ever had. Um, Embracing online technology, and it's these experiences that make me every day think how wonderful the internet is when it works for us. If I can give you one funny but absolutely true example, it's what I call the cornflake story. Can I tell you that story? So
Absolutely. I'm interested. I'm intrigued.
the cornflake story is back in the 1990s when I was still living in the UK. Um, and online shopping at supermarkets arrived, and I was thinking this is fantastic because traipsing around a supermarket for an hour with someone who didn't really want to be with me buying stuff that I needed to buy was always a fairly demoralizing experience. So being able to do it online and again on my own was something which I was really looking forward to, and it did blow my mind, and it was very successful. But the thing that really blew my mind was the realization of how many variations of cornflakes there were. I had no idea. I thought there was possibly Kellogg's. Other brands probably are available. I didn't know. In a box, big box, little box. That was it. It turned out there were dozens of varieties and combinations. I was mesmerized, and in those days we were still on dial-up modem.
I guess though it's a stark reminder that when someone does have a visual impairment, that walking down an aisle of a shopping supermarket
Yeah,
and seeing everything there, that's not something. I mean, we take that for granted, but it's
yeah.
clearly something that isn't part of your day to day. So being able to have that accessible platform that actually explains each of those varieties or options, yeah, you're right. What an
I,
amazing thing to have. Um,
yeah.
I'm assuming you didn't even get to the bread aisle yet.
The bread aisle and the milk aisle then just well, I needed broadband for that, to be honest with you, Nick. I could not cope with the variety of options. But it's exactly what you said, though, to be serious. It's exactly what you said. It's that realization that you have choices that everybody else has, and you didn't have them before, and what's more, you didn't even realize you didn't have them before.
Wow. Well, I'm hearing Neil's lived experience. I mean, it kind of really sets the reality of the situation. For someone like yourself that looks after teams and accessibility is front and mind for you, why is accessibility important in the platforms that you create?
Sorry, was that aimed at me? I cut out a little bit there.
Yeah, Llewelyn, sorry. Yeah, so for someone who has those platforms and you're hearing the lived experience of someone like Neil, why is accessibility so important to you?
Well, at UHI, at the University of Highlands Islands, inclusivity is a really big deal for us. It's one of our prime mandates. And if you don't have accessible content, then you're not being inclusive. So it's part of the core message and sort of principle that we want to instill at the university is to make sure that everybody can get access to education and with the appropriate tools for them as well. So it's a huge deal for the university in that case.
Hugh, we're delivering over 200 projects every single year for customers in Europe and the UK. Talk a little bit around the delivery side. Why does accessibility matter for us?
I think it matters for us because we have chosen our niche, and that is to support customers that want to provide services to their customers. And most of those require some element of self-service. And actually, our focus at Squiz on helping customers deliver services more seamlessly to their end customers, be that local residents, be that government staff. All of it's wrapped up in trying to make digital life, less full of friction, make it frictionless. And part of that, as Llewelyn said, is making sure that we're inclusive in the way we do things. I think for some of us doing development day to day, we forget sometimes that some of the things that we're building might look beautiful, but have a wide range of digitally enabled people trying to access them in different formats and different ways. And I think, the frustrations of possibly remembering using the old original sort of GeoCities, table-based layouts, and it is frustrating when websites and applications don't work properly. But when that problem and frustration's doubled or tripled even for people that are trying to use accessible tools to navigate their way around them, it's important to remember that and include that in the design process all the way through build, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later.
Yeah, it's a really interesting insight there, Hugh. You talk about these service-based orientations. Government is a huge one of those. And I guess for most of us, we can't really choose which government we work with or interact with day to day. We live in a city, we live in a country, and that's the government that we need to deal with. And quite often it's those people that need those accessibility tools that most often need those government services. Previously to working at Squiz, I was actually head of government digital services in South Australia. And so, it's really stark in our mind that 1 out of every 5 people needed accessibility tools to some level. And more importantly, everyone was a citizen and everyone needed to be able to interact with those government websites. Neil, can you tell us a little bit around the globe, what's happening with governments and accessibility? It feels like it's on an increase. It feels like it's becoming more of the conversation. Is that the reality? Is there regulation to back it up?
It's definitely on the increase, no question about that. And it's definitely improving. You take examples like in the US, Section 508 is basically a tranche of legislation that requires, if you want to be a vendor in the federal market in the US, you basically have to meet web content accessibility guidelines up to version 2.0 still, which is quite remarkable. Not yet 2.1 and certainly not 2.2 beta, but 2.0 AA, and that's a really positive thing, because most of the people who talk to us at Intopia, who are potential suppliers to government in the US, they know that they only have to reach 2.0, but they want to go to 2.1 anyway, because they know it's coming, and they want to get ahead of the curve, if you like. And in other parts of the world, in New Zealand, where I'm based, government departments are mandated under a thing called the Web Accessibility Standards to reach Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA, but with a few exemptions, but not many. The problem is, and this is a problem that does happen even when there is regulation, in the case of New Zealand, it's not legislative regulation. It's a decision by government, but it's not legislative requirement. So there's no comeback if a government department doesn't actually meet those requirements. Hence the problems I had getting back into the country a few months ago. But it's clearly a signal of intent, and that's always good. And it's better than not having a signal intent, as long as they do something about that. I know you've got experience in Australia as well.
Yeah, look, that's right. And so I know that when I was working within the government, the Digital Inclusion Act was passed. It was one of the first pieces of legislation passed by the South Australian government. And for us, that was a real call to arms, that not only did we need to make sure that all of the government platforms were accessible, that procurement considered accessibility, that applications we used within government were accessible for our staff. But on top of that, I think there's a real role that government needs to play in educating and elevating the importance of accessibility for private businesses as well, who maybe don't have someone on their staff who is an accessibility champion, or may not even be aware that accessibility is a thing. And so I think the role that government plays is twofold, both in making sure its platforms are absolutely accessible, but then playing a role to help inform and educate people on what good accessible platforms in our common day is. So you can see all of the cornflakes, Neil.
And I would say that the South Australian example is a really good one, because the accessibility toolkit, which was put together in South Australia, is used by a lot of non-governmental organisations as a model for how to build their own accessible content.
Yeah, that's right, Neil. So accessibility.sa.gov.au. I was very honoured to be part of the team that put that together, with a guy called Raf Segal and also Cliff Edwards. And really that toolkit was about saying that when we're creating digital things, each person throughout that digital project, whether it's the project manager, the designer, the developer, the content writer, we all play a role in creating digitally accessible things, whether that's apps, whether that's websites or otherwise. Speaking of apps, and I guess a really interesting part here is that once upon a time, we just had a computer sitting on our desk, or maybe a laptop. We've moved to mobiles, we've moved to tablets, different brands, different sizes, different shapes, different ways of operating. Obviously, people's bandwidth is also something we need to consider as far as their digital access. Let's talk a little bit about devices for a second, and accessibility on devices. Obviously, there's screen readers, Neil, that you might be using on a desktop. What about mobile devices? Is that easier, harder?
It's another device, and it has some advantages, some disadvantages. I do use mobile devices all the time, both um, iOS and Android, um, partly because that's my job, but partly because I'm a geek, and partly because I'm also it's just what I'm interested in doing. But I also still heavily rely on computer access through mostly Windows, sorry to say, but sometimes even a Mac as well. So
Mm,
all the environments have their own strengths and weaknesses. The important thing is that some accessibility solutions are better than others.
okay. And I'm guessing some of those are built into devices. I know Microsoft has spent a lot of time
Yes.
making sure that their productivity suites have accessibility not just baked in, but at the absolute, kind of forefront uh, of their tools. iOS have some really great accessibility tools, again, built into the device itself.
Yeah.
Is there any that you see doing a really great job?
Yeah. I think Apple is to be commended for leading the way on that baked-in idea because nobody else ever had before. So an Apple Mac computer, when you first turn it on, when you get it from the shop or from your um, supplier of choice, the first thing that will happen is it will start talking to you. You've got to turn that off before you start finishing off your installation. Now, um, I can tell you after decades of not having that kind of access, that is marvelous.
Mm,
And the same happens with Windows now. When you turn Windows on, narrator will pop up and start talking to you. You have to dismiss it before it will go away, and that's I'm talking at the pre-installation phase. So to me, that's revolutionary, and that's just
mm,
really really good. It's built into iOS, as you say. It's very easy to switch it on and also switch it off again if you're sharing your phone with somebody. And similar with Android, it's built into most Android devices too. Um,
mm.
but it took us a long time to get there.
Accessibility by default feels like
Yeah,
it's where we're going. Again,
yeah,
not if anything, a minor button press for a lot of people and a big help for those that need it. That sounds great.
yeah, yeah.
Llewelyn, we've talked about the lived experience. We've talked about the importance of accessibility and a little bit around the role that government plays. For you, who's on the coalface, who's actually building digital things day to day, talk about the task of accessibility for an organisation like UHI.
Well, we're a very small web team at UHI. There's currently actually only two of us running 14 websites, um, which is quite a big remit. But we do have a lot of academic staff and other administration staff that have access to a content management system to be able to add content to the website. So unfortunately, it very much falls on sort of my shoulders and my colleagues' shoulders to take care of accessibility. But one of the most important things for us is education to the rest of the staff in UHI, and that's one of the hardest things to get across because the accessibility guidelines are quite large and sometimes convoluted. To distill that information down and produce it to people who aren't as necessarily as tech savvy as maybe myself or my colleagues in my team, distill that information and pass it on in a way that's useful for that person in their job. That's one of the hardest challenges that we have. But also making sure that all of our sites are accessible on, as you say, all devices. So designing for mobile first, making sure we have enough real estate with the content that we have, making sure it fits, it works, it's usable, it's readable. That's a really big part of it as well.
Yeah. Hugh, Cabinet Office have been doing the rounds with a lot of universities here in the UK and other government organisations the last 12 months, making sure that all of those sites are accessible as part of their audit. Can you talk a little bit about the Squiz platform? I know that a lot of those universities have been leaning on our tools to make sure that their platforms are accessible and that audit is as smooth as possible. Talk a little bit about maybe how using the Squiz DXP we're able to keep accessibility front of mind.
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this. One part is if you're in a great position to be building your project from scratch, at which point you want to make sure you're doing everything right first time round to make your life easier. And even so, building projects with accessibility first by default, you say, is still a challenge. The biggest challenge is maintaining that level of accessibility through natural growth and content churn, team editor churn, and all those kind of things. So you need a platform that's going to help you with that. As Llewelyn said, one of the key things is making sure that people creating the content have the contextual awareness of what they're creating. So one of the things that we're very pleased to have in our platform is the code sniffer. So there's the Squiz accessibility code sniffer. That's actually embedded in the content management system, and it's contextually aware. So you can load it up for the particular container or page that you're working on, and you can also run it separately as a plugin, as a bookmarklet to actually run on the entire front end of the site in context of the site and design itself as well. So yeah, in terms of giving editors the tools they need to get a quick snapshot and overview of where they might have gone wrong, it's very useful because it breaks down the very verbose guidelines and various numbered legalese kind of clauses and elements down into actually actionable changes to fix things, which I think is a key part. The other thing is we also have an auditing tool in Funnelback, the search engine that we have in the platform, which will take more of a kind of holistic approach, and you can run a scheduled crawl and it will produce you a full report based on the accessibility level you're aiming for, which is more useful as an auditing tool for web management teams to actually make sure that they're distributed editors that probably only use the system once or twice a month to make small changes aren't collectively dropping the score too far. But yeah, I think that's the key difference is small cuts. You can die a death by 1,000 cuts of multiple small changes. Auditing them can be tricky, and maintaining a log of where things have changed and fixing them to get back on track's key. I think we'll talk about project first later.
Yeah. Neil, hearing that there's some really great tech that helps start the accessibility audit process, I'm guessing as a consultant at Intopia, part of your experience is that it needs to be a blended response to auditing, doesn't it? You need people with lived experience in there too.
Well, you need three things, I think. You need the automated tools. They are very important, and they're part of anybody's toolkit, I think, and strongly advocate for people using them. But you also need manual technical auditing as well if you're really going to get deep into it, because automated tools are wonderful, but they'll only pick up a certain amount of issues, and not always necessarily the they won't necessarily pick up things in context or tell you what are the high priority fixes that you need to make, whereas a good technical manual audit will do that. So we always advocate and recommend for that as well, as a second string to the bow. And yes, the third one is definitely usability testing by people who actually have a range of disabilities or a range of access requirements. That is essential because you can create a website or an app, any digital product with which follows the WCAG guidelines as closely as possible and do really well. But they can still be a nightmare to use for the end user for whatever reason. So manual testing by users, manual testing by users is a really good way to find out what your product is really like when it hits a live person. And then in that situation, you'll get two things. One is you'll get to feel good when they achieve the tasks that they're meant to be able to achieve with your product. That is always, I mean, we all know that makes you feel good. But you'll also realize what you may not have realized before if they're having problems doing something which you assumed was going to be okay because the tools and the audit told you that it was going to be okay because it reached compliance levels. Then if someone is struggling to do that job that they shouldn't be struggling to do, then you can go back and ask yourself, okay, what is it that's causing that to happen? So you'll not get that with any kind of compliance test. So it's really good to have real people testing your product. Yeah.
Neil, that makes a lot of sense. In our current world where I'm going to lean a little bit on your cornflakes example. So shopping is one of the things that a lot of people do. But
Yep.
also, a lot of people spend a lot of time on social media these days, right?
Yes.
TikTok or YouTube or different platforms. That time to consume content as one of those channels, is that an accessible space where people are spending their time? Are we finding that there's still challenges in those worlds?
Oh yeah, well, since Elon Musk took over Twitter, we all know the stories about how he sacked the entire accessibility team in one day. That was pretty remarkable. So Twitter has always been a very accessible space. It's gradually losing that because, as we all know, with accessibility, you can't just set it and forget it. You have to maintain it. And that is not happening with that particular platform right now. But there are still a lot of people who are using it perfectly happily. So, but we are worried about that in the future. Facebook is another one which people are using quite happily, and YouTube and LinkedIn and platforms like those are certainly accessible to most people. You'll get some challenges with things like Instagram, I guess, because it's obviously very visual based, but the actual platform itself is quite accessible. It's just the content on it which may not be.
It's really interesting when you think about distributed content creators, though. You go from big organizations that have existed and maybe had that as part of their way of working to what probably feels like now individual contributors who are building content, looking after fans, doing those kind of
Yep.
things that need to also, I think,
Yep.
consider what the influencer space maybe is doing when it comes to accessibility.
Yes.
Llewelyn, you're a content creator day in and day out. What are some of the easy traps that you see people fall into when it comes to accessibility, things that often get overlooked or missed?
Well, there's the obvious ones like image alt tags, which people forget to add. One of the biggest ones most recently has been around video content, actually, and making that more accessible, or at least as accessible as is practically possible for the person or the organization doing that. Because there is quite a lot around making a video accessible to do if you want it to be fully accessible, for everybody. And things like getting sign language translations overlaid and options for that it's one of the difficulties we have at UHI, for instance. But with as you were speaking about earlier about Instagram and TikTok and things, with the rise of that video platform being very visual medium, I think it's really important that those platforms consider accessibility not just from a creator's perspective, but from their own perspective about the tools that they offer creators to make things accessible. And I think, and Neil will obviously be able to speak with much more authority than me on this, but I think they're getting better.
Yes.
Instagram has an auto caption service and an auto reader service, so it will read out your captions for you, and so does TikTok and things like that. So it's getting better, but we're not there with video yet, and it is one of the most pertinent things that we're trying to tackle right now.
There's some very interesting not even experimentation, but just developments in this space. Facebook was one of the first social media platforms to introduce AI description of photographs. And whilst most of us who actually rely on that don't think very highly of it, we applaud the effort to start the process. And I think it's an example of where the technology may go in the future. But you do raise a good question, because one of the most popular things that we get asked for at Intopia is checklists for do's and don'ts around accessibility of social media.
Really interesting. I'm guessing during the pandemic as well, because we talk about, again, TikTok, maybe not necessarily the most critical of things to be consuming, but enjoyable and really important as part of a well-rounded online experience. Thinking about the pandemic specifically, there was probably a lot of really critical, crucial information that needed to be conversed. And I think about back to my time when I was working in the South Australian government. We had all our information that was about either how close people could be in proximity, or particular rules or things they were able to do, data and information. I mean, this stuff is really critical, and making sure that that's accessible, not having flat image files of graphs and those kind of things. Neil, during the pandemic, did you notice much of that critical information that was held back from you?
Yes, because so much, obviously, a lot of it was happening in literally in real time, as
Mm.
the phrase went. They were building the plane while they were flying it. So what happened with quite a few examples was they fell back on doing infographics and that sort of thing, and a lot of the data information about how the pandemic was spreading, how many cases there were in a given area, which was crucial to know. Most of that was in infographics or some other kind of data visualization. It wasn't in text format that we could
Mm.
easily use. So that was one of the biggest gaps that we saw. But definitely, some people have reported, especially people who are themselves already isolated, socially speaking, that they failed to know where to go to get critical information. I think if they were doing it again, they would do it better. But
Mm.
yeah, there were certainly a few examples of the ball being dropped.
Hugh, I'm going to come over to you for a second. Obviously, you're saying Squiz does hundreds of projects every single year for organisations where accessibility is critical. Let's talk about the project process for a moment, because really that's where we say, if we can start at the very start of a project, of a build, of a new website, baking accessibility in at that point is really important. I know the Squiz
Mhm.
DXP has our component service, so pre-made components, accessibility check, UAT check, ready to go. Talk a little bit about the project process that Squiz follows and how we make sure accessibility stays front of mind for everybody.
Yeah, so by default, we aim for AA standards. If the customer hasn't defined any other requirements, that's our aim always as a bare minimum. Some of our customers require triple, which obviously, as we all know, is a lot more fun and more involved. Part of our discovery process will build out an idea of the client base, the customer base, the personas, get a better idea of the target users for the site. As part of that, we'll often identify particular needs that need to be considered, either through a amended design or a different section of the site, or those needs will be wrapped into the main project. Generally, in design, we have a variety of, again, tools and plugins available for our default build sets. So we tend to use Figma or InDesign, and we use a variety of different plugins there to check color gradients, to check color clashes for color blindness, to check things like spacing for finger clicking and all those kind of things in our designs. Once the designs have had a review and gone through QA, the mock-ups and the initial builds will get checked via a variety of the tools that we've already mentioned. We'll usually also put that through front-end testing with something like the Wave browser plugin or the Axe tool, which is very useful, and a variety of other plugins that we've got. The team will then build that, and it will go off for testing. Where possible, as we've already mentioned, we do like to make sure that we've got any teams that are available or people that are available that have particular needs have actually sat down and tested the product before it's ready for launch, and that feedback's considered. We also often recommend, if a customer doesn't have the resources available to necessarily do that or manage that themselves, that they consider using a third party. And we also like to make sure at a bare minimum we've provided all of the subscription-free options going forward for making sites accessible, like the things like the Recite Me plugin and various other tools available to make life easier for users. So that's generally how we run through anything that we produce and make available as a component on our marketplace. As you've already mentioned, Nick, will have been through accessibility testing and been approved.
Yeah, that's great. You've mentioned a bunch of plugins there. Quick poll to everybody. What are some of your favorite accessibility tools that you use? This will be good hints for maybe some of our audience to go and try afterwards. So let's start with you, Llewelyn. What's one of your favorite go-to tools?
Honestly, we use Funnelback a lot. That's
I
our
didn't pay
search
you for
engine. It runs our search and it does accessibility checks for us as a sort of code. What do you call it? Code
sniffer.
Sniffer, that's it. Yeah. So we use Funnelback a lot. We use another one that's called Axe DevTools, and that's what UK government have been using to audit sites, as far as I'm aware, as well. And then lastly, the combination of things, as Neil was saying, it's important to actually get a human person looking at stuff. So we do content spot checks around what people have recently been putting up on our sites as well, to make sure that they are accessible properly, not just ticking the boxes for the guidelines, but also actually practically accessible.
Great. And I know there are online accessibility testing tools where you can actually prescript in your testing audience for people that have accessibility needs, so they can actually test it. So if you don't know somebody who has that need, there are definitely online platforms where you can subscribe to get people to help there. Neil, as a consultant, I'm guessing you get this question a lot. What are some of your go-tos?
I would echo the accessibility tool as well. I think it's an excellent tool, and a lot of people like the Wave tool that WebAIM produce, and I mean those are two very very good ones. Accessibility Insights, I think, is another one that we use quite a lot. So those are certainly three good ones I can think of off the top of my head. So yeah, they're good.
Yeah, nice. For me, I think the accessibility toolkit that the South Australian government put out is a really
Yeah,
helpful tool. And I
it
guess
is.
as someone who's not deeply in the code, there's often the need for a project manager or maybe a project sponsor to understand accessibility better. And so, yeah, accessibility.sa.gov.au, lots of different checklists and tools for not just those developing and designing, but actually influencing and creating the projects too. So that way everybody is considering accessibility as part of the project.
Nick, could I also
I'm going to throw
mention
to yeah.
Could I also just mention the what we call the not checklist, which Intopia provides, um, which is literally a means by which you can sort the list by success criteria, or you can sort it by role. So it might be a developer, a designer, a tester, whatever you want the role is, and that way you can work to find out what which part of WCAG particularly applies to you.
Mm. So, I mean, during our last kind of 25 minutes, we spoke a lot about lived experience, the role the government plays, the things we do as teams creating. Who is doing accessibility well out in the world? Obviously, no one's perfect, but there probably are some shining stars of people doing really great work. Neil, I know that you've probably got some examples in spaces like banking and areas like that. Who can you recommend is doing it great in Europe?
The BBC is actually one of the best ones. The reason why it is because we always find that the ones who are the best are the ones who have accessibility baked into their DNA as much as
Mm.
possible. And you've talked about that already. You and Hugh have both talked about how that works for Squiz. And I think it is really important because the BBC actually led the way for many years on the thought leadership around accessibility in the UK. And even though some of the people who made up that team are no longer there, they have left behind them a really good example of what happens when you bake accessibility into your online platforms. Not perfect, like you say, but pretty good. And then I
Mm.
think another good one I could mention in the in the private sector is in Australia. There's a supermarket chain called Coles, and
Mm.
it went from being a website that had some real accessibility challenges and was actually the subject of a legal case. And rather than get all defensive and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers to fight the complainant, they decided that they would actually try and solve the problem that the complainant
Mm.
had. And they have turned their online platform around so that their website is, again, not perfect. We find things with it all the time, but it is still a shining example of what an organization can do, even when it's not doing a good job, to move towards doing a very good job. And Coles is a great example of doing a good job now.
They really are. I know that from the Australian Access Awards, Cole
Yes,
won for not just the work that they do, but also the ethos they create. They have an
yes,
accessibility team, and that's
yes.
great, but they spend a lot of time training the rest of their teams as well, which I find a really powerful piece of the way they do things. That's fantastic. I know Lloyds Bank also here in the UK
Yes.
are very strong when it comes to accessibility, and so it's great to see that there are some platforms out there that really are setting the tone there. I know that when you look at universities, LSBU, London South Bank, they use Recite Me, and I think that they put a lot of time into their accessibility too, along with obviously UHI. As we get towards the end of this webinar now, we've spoke a lot about the various challenges that exist. Let's talk a little bit about paths forward. I guess like any good exercise plan, getting started is the first piece. But Neil, if I can lean on you in the first instance, where should people go to either start or restart or reignite their accessibility programs?
I think it's really important to recognize that organizations are at different places on the accessibility. I dare use the word journey, but there you go. I think it's really important to recognize that accessibility isn't something that happens in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is an accessible platform. It takes time. It's a marathon and not a sprint, as they say.
Mm.
And I think it's important to find a good accessibility partner who can advise you, um, or to have a really powerful in-house team. But you don't usually have that at the beginning. A lot of work happens. We do a lot of work with organizations, helping them to become what we would call more digitally accessibly mature, and that is ensuring that they take the first baby steps, and they may be small things. It might be one website out of several that they have, or one app that they have, but it's using that as a shining example of what can be done. When they do that, they move on to the next one, and that whole process may take several years, but that's okay. It's a process that can take years. And then I think the critical thing is to maintain that. So accessibility is never done. You develop your websites and your apps all the time. So you're going to need to maintain the accessibility of those websites and apps all the time. So very important to constantly check, recheck, make sure that you haven't broken something accidentally, because it happens. And so always go back and make accessibility as important to you as security is.
Mm. It's a really good recommendation. Llewelyn, what about yourself? What do you think are some of those steps to help someone get started?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a steep learning curve, I think, when you're trying to learn accessibility from scratch, and so it can seem quite intimidating. So I think just first of all, finding out what product you're using, or what the things that you use, find out how accessible they are, and maybe what tools they've been using, and try and do some research into that, and try and relate these things to the guidelines as well, so that you can try and gain a better understanding of what the guidelines mean, because they're not always super clear. Speaking from experience, having read a lot of them. So yeah, it's really just about just getting your foot in the door and starting up, looking up things, asking people who you might know, watching webinars like the one we're doing now for extra information, finding tips and tricks. So there's a plethora of things out there, and I think it can be difficult to know where to get started, and you got to take small steps first.
So maybe find a project to start with, as opposed to tackling your whole website in the first instance. Maybe find a project and start there. Hugh, is that kind of your recommendation as well?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
I'd say if a website, start with the homepage first of all, and then do the rest of the pages afterwards. Do it in small parts rather than the big chunks.
Yeah, exactly. The advice we tend to give people is start with your most traffic pages. If you fix structural issues, templating issues there, you're naturally going to improve your results across the board for other areas. And again, then just move through the list. And obviously, as we've already said, be careful with tools, because obviously they might throw up lots of issues. Quite often you find yourself fixing one issue and creating 3 other ones. So do try and prioritize. So I think the thing to remember is that prioritization is key. So start with your most traffic pages, start with the biggest, most glaring issues, work back from there and constantly re-baseline.
Good advice. Liam has shared on our audience channel that the Home Office have some really great accessibility tools. If you go to design.homeoffice.gov.uk/accessibility, there's a really great UK public sector standard. But Ross has actually asked a question here, and I think maybe this is a good one for everybody to help. He said that if I wanted to improve my knowledge around accessibility, what would you recommend as the best resource for a starting place? Is there a website or maybe an organisation that people could go to as a stepping point and starting point? Let's go with Neil. Neil, do you want to maybe... Is Intopia your first suggestion?
Well, of course it is. Yes. We absolutely do training, and training is a critical part of an organisation like ours. And so find a good accessibility training organisation and ask them what they do and what makes them different to anybody else. Shop around. But eventually come to Intopia, obviously, yeah.
I guess that's a good point, though. There are accessibility consultancies, aren't there? There are people
Yes.
who are skilled experts who can help get the journey started and come up with a plan
Yes.
collaboratively. Maxim says W3C is also a good option. Obviously,
Yes.
the regulating body for WCAG. Llewelyn, what about yourself? What do you think? Where's a good resource to start?
There's two things I would recommend doing, I think. One of them is trying out a free code sniffer to see what it tells you, and then try and relate those to the guidelines and see sort of why it's failing and what you could do to maybe make it better. So it's sort of twofold there, is combining the guidelines with a sniffer to see how that works. And then the other thing I would recommend is as you say, is try and find somebody who has accessibility needs or accessible needs, and speak to them about their experience about using things or using whatever you're trying to make more accessible itself. But W3C is also, I'd have to recommend that highly, because it's a sort of resource I use continuously.
Same. Yeah.
Hugh, what about for yourself, more the practical developer side of things?
Ask ChatGPT to summarize the standards for you.
There we go.
One of my colleagues actually...
It can also produce rather useful code examples as well. So you can, you can hive mind some decent solutions, but make sure you test them first.
Yes.
I haven't checked whether ChatGPT is actually accessible in itself yet. Maybe it needs to double check and code itself. There we go.
It is to a degree, but not. Yeah. One of my colleagues actually did an exercise where he tried to get ChatGPT to design an accessible version of itself.
Still working on that one, I'm guessing. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today. I think we've explored some really interesting topics and really helped to kind of maybe demystify some of the pieces of accessibility that may be overwhelming and clearly set some paths for the way forward. If I could ask each of you for a last word of either advice or thought when it comes to accessibility, the products you use, the teams you manage, or the lived experience you have. Llewelyn, would you like to start?
I'd say that accessibility is everywhere and it impacts every facet of your life. So don't just think that it's digital that you have to think about accessibility and making things accessible. It also permeates throughout physical accessibility and everywhere else in your life. So really take some strong observations about why things might be inaccessible for other people and sort of check your privilege, I guess.
Very good. Hugh?
Yeah, it's that. It's just be mindful. Just be mindful the things that you're creating aren't for just one audience. And I think that's the key thing.
Neil, what about yourself?
I know I'd echo all of that, but I think I'd also say be prepared to take time. Don't get scared by the immensity of accessibility. It is big, but it's doable. And play the long game as well. Build accessibility into your culture, because if you do that, you've got a better chance of having an accessible product.
Well said. Knowing that 1 in 5 people have an accessibility need, if you thought about pushing 1 out of 5 of your customers out the front door, it sounds crazy. You wouldn't do it. Why do we do it online? Thank you very much to each of you for your time today and your passion and your continued involvement in accessibility. To each of our audience participants today and everyone who's joined on, thank you again for your time. Accessibility is really important for Squiz. It's baked into our DNA. It's baked into our product. Our mission is that we create services online that improve lives offline. We know that improvement comes from just being able to use websites sometimes, making sure they're accessible and making sure that everybody has digital tools that work. If you have needs from the accessibility space, obviously Intopia, Squiz, we're here to help. And we welcome any conversations that you may wish to have as you go on your, and I'm going to use the term, Neil, accessibility journey as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. We'll put this webinar online as soon as we can. We'll also make sure we grab all of the links that we've spoke about throughout today and maybe a couple of others into a blog page and share it with everyone over the coming week or so. Go well, have a great day, and thanks for caring about accessibility.